Her voice cracked on a word she had not spoken in 9 centuries. Elder Missouri rose from the highest alcove of the obsidian citadel. The 2 guards nearest her lowered their spears, though no one had given the order. Their hands simply obeyed something older than rank, some instinct buried under generations of drill that told them silence like hers only broke for a reason worth kneeling to. Emperor Vexrath's head turned a fraction of an inch. In 847 years on the throne, no one had ever interrupted a council session. Not once, not during the Cathari surrender, not during the fire that took the western spire, not even during his own coronation when a rival house had tried and failed to seize the floor. "You did not see the ship," Missouri said. Her lips barely moved. 402 years, and you never saw it. The incense smoke above the brazier bent sideways, toward her, though no vent in the chamber ran that way. A servant near the far wall noticed it and said nothing. He had learned long ago that noticing things in this room was a dangerous habit. No guards moved, no advisors spoke, no one in the chamber breathed. Even Zaraketh, who had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of looking unbothered, felt her fingers tighten around the data pane she was holding until the metal edge bit into her palm. Vexrath's molten eyes narrowed. He had never once been wrong, not in 8 centuries of rule, and he had built an empire on that single fact the way other kings built theirs on steel. He had learned, long before most species on the Concord's registry had learned to write, that certainty was its own kind of weapon. You did not need to be right. You only needed to never once admit you weren't. Explain yourself, Elder. Missouri did not answer yet. Her gaze drifted to the crystal ceiling, to the cold stars past it, as if she were looking for something that had been there the whole time and no one else had thought to check. Her large dark eyes, pale in the torchlight, held on one point in the sky a moment too long. I wish I could tell you this throne saw what was coming. It didn't. 900 years of silence was about to end, and I promise you it would not survive the sound. 6 hours earlier, the vote had already been cast. The council chamber had smelled the way it always smelled before a war was declared, which was to say it smelled like nothing at all. Ozone from the shield generators, old incense burned down to ashen brass bowls that had not been cleaned since the last coronation. A room built to make its occupants feel small enough to obey and grand enough to never question why. 389 senators raised their hands for the annexation order. 14 did not. Vexrath did not bother reading their names. He had learned long ago that descent from small, frightened species meant nothing at all, and he said as much to Zaraketh without lowering his voice, because there was no one in that chamber whose opinion of him mattered enough to soften his tone for. Category 3. High Ambassador Zaraketh said, scrolling a data pane that hovered beside the throne. Her iridescent blue skin caught the torchlight in slow ripples, the kind that made junior diplomats forget what they'd come to say. 3,000 ships in their whole system. 72 cycles to full occupation. Nothing worth logging as resistance. And the 14 who voted against it? Species who have met humans before. Zaraketh said it the way she might mention a species that still cooked over open fire. A fact worth noting only because it was quaint. None of them have ever been right about anything, Your Majesty. Vexrath almost smiled. It was a small thing, a slight curl at the corner of his mouth that his aides had learned to read as pleasure, though none of them could remember the last time it had reached his eyes. He had dismissed this species 3 separate times across his reign, and 3 separate times the galaxy had shrugged and agreed with him. Humanity had shown up in old reports as a footnote, a species content to farm its handful of border worlds and stay out of the way. He signed the order without reading past the first line. Send the notice to the border colonies, he said. Give them the standard 72 hours. 72 hours is generous, Your Majesty, Zaraketh said, already keying the transmission. I am aware of how generous I am. He said it without malice, the way a man states a fact about the weather. No one in that chamber noticed the 14 dissenting senators exchange a glance. No one noticed that the glance passed, one after another, down the row until it reached the oldest of them, and that the oldest of them simply closed her eyes and said nothing. 200 light-years away, inside a ship shaped like a shard of black ice, Commander Sira Valdez read the same order twice. She sat in the command chair with a chipped ceramic mug in her hand. The paint on the side had faded down to a ghost of 4 numbers, 8400 hours. She had carried that mug on 14 missions, through 2 hull breaches and 1 near collision with a debris field that should have ended her career and her life both. It was the only thing left from her father, who had served on Earth's first interstellar freighter and never came home from his last run. She kept the tea in it black and let it go cold more often than she drank it. Today was one of those days. She set the mug down without drinking from it. Lieutenant Kane, her voice did not rise. It never did. 24 years in this uniform had taught her that a raised voice was a kind of confession, an admission that the situation had gotten away from you, and she had never once let a bridge see her lose control of a room. Elias Kane looked up from his console. His left hand, scarred across the knuckles from an accident he never talked about, rested near a photograph of his daughter clipped to the panel edge. He smelled faintly of old coffee and engine grease, the way he always did after a double shift running diagnostics on the cloak array. "Commander," pull the long silence protocol. Kane's hand stopped moving. For a second, he looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just said something he needs repeated. "Ma'am, that protocol has been active since before either of us was born. I'm aware. 402 years. That's not a switch. That's a promise." He said the word like it weighed something. To him it did. He had grown up hearing stories about the ships that watched and waited, the quiet fleet nobody outside a handful of command staff even believed still existed. He had joined the service half expecting the whole thing to be a myth kept alive by old officers who liked the romance of it. "I know exactly what it is, Lieutenant." She picked the mug back up, though she still didn't drink. "Pull it anyway." Kane keyed the release. Across the ship, indicator lights that had stayed dark for 4 centuries came alive one panel at a time. Small green stars blinking on and rose down the length of the corridor outside the bridge. A low hum rose from somewhere beneath the deck plating, a sound the ship's newest crew had never heard before because it had never needed to make it. "Protocol lifted," Kane said, jaw tight. "Commander, once we do this, there's no putting it back." "That was never the point of hiding," Valdez said. "We didn't go quiet to stay quiet forever. We went quiet to be ready when it mattered." She stood and crossed to the viewport. Beyond the ice ring of the dead world, where the warden had sat cloaked for 400 years, the dark between stars looked the same as it had every night of her career. It would not look the same much longer, and some small part of her, the part that still remembered being 19 and terrified on her first deployment, wondered if she was ready for that. "Ready in the system," said Petty Officer Dahl, glancing up from her station. She was barely 30, and she had never lived one day under the long silence protocol, as anything but an old rule inherited from a war she'd only read about in training files, the way a person might know the outline of a grandparent's life without ever having met them.
"Cloak status? Hold the cloak," Valdez said. For now, she opened a file that hadn't been touched in years, a short list of names.
Officers who had held her chair before her and never lived to see the mission finish, who had spent their whole careers watching a war that never came, and who had died believing it might never come at all. She read it once, closed it, and didn't open it again. "You knew this day would come," Kane said quietly, not quite a question. "I hoped it wouldn't." She set the file aside, "But I never once doubted we'd be ready if it did." Back on the throne world, the council chamber had already moved on to trade routes and border tariffs. Zarakith stood at Vexrath's side, running through the next agenda item in a voice bored smooth by 3 centuries of practice, each word landing with the same flat rhythm as the last. Elder Missouri sat in her alcove, silent, watching the crystal ceiling the way she had watched it for 900 years, waiting for a shape that had not come yet. It came 4 hours later. No sirens sounded. No sensor grid flagged a threat. A ship 1.2 kilometers long simply existed above the capital where a moment before there had been only stars, as if it had always been there and the sky itself had finally admitted it. The first person to notice was not a soldier. It was a kitchen worker on the palace's lowest terrace, carrying a tray of ceremonial wine, who looked up out of habit and dropped the tray without a single sound reaching the throne room above. He stood frozen, staring at a black shape that blotted out a swath of stars twice the width of the moon, and could not find his voice to call for anyone at all. By the time the alarm finally sounded, it was already too late to matter. It rippled up from the kitchens to the guard barracks to the throne room in under a minute, but a minute was enough. Every screen in the Obsidian Citadel flickered to the same feed, a ship the length of a mountain range sitting motionless above the capital, running no lights, sending no demands, doing nothing but existing where nothing should have been able to exist unseen. Zarakith's data pane chimed. She looked down at it, then up at the feed, then down again, as if the second look might correct the first. "That's not possible," she said. and for the first time in 3 centuries, her voice had lost its practiced flatness. Our perimeter grid would have flagged anything larger than a shuttle a full cycle out. Then your perimeter grid is wrong, Vexrath said. He had not yet risen from the throne. He would not give this thing, whatever it was, the satisfaction of his surprise. A transmission opened on every channel at once, military and civilian alike, cutting through court broadcasts and market feeds and children's programs with the same flat, even tone. "This is Commander Sarah Valdez of the Warden." Her voice carried no anger, no triumph, nothing that could be mistaken for either. "We have been watching your throne for 402 years, the annexation order is noted. It is rejected." The chamber went still in a different way than it had for Missouri. This was the stillness of an animal that has just realized the ground beneath it is not ground at all. 402 years, Zarakith repeated, quieter now, testing the number against everything she knew and finding nothing in her memory that could hold it. "Identify the source," Vexrath said. "Trace it. There's nothing to trace, Your Majesty. The logs show it's been there the entire time." Kane's voice came back over the same open channel, dry as old paper. "We know your weaknesses. We know your secrets. We know the names of the 14 senators you're planning to have removed by winter." A pause, just long enough to let that land. "We know your intelligence apparatus classified an entire species as unremarkable." On the terrace below, the kitchen worker had finally found his voice, and it came out as a single short scream that no one in the throne room heard over the sound of the transmission. Vexrath's four-fingered hands closed slowly around the armrests of his throne, claw tips worn smooth from 8 centuries of exactly this gesture. He had made this exact motion before wars, before executions, before the only 2 moments in his reign anyone had ever seen him lose his composure. Both times he had won. He told himself this was no different. "You will withdraw that ship," he said, "or I will show you exactly what unremarkable is not." "You had 3,000 ships ready for our border colonies," Valdez's voice answered. "We had 402 years to prepare for this exact conversation. I'd ask you to consider which of us planned longer." Zarakith's hands trembled against the data pane. Though she kept her face composed by pure force of habit, she had never lost a negotiation. She had built her entire career on reading a room, before the room knew what it wanted, and she could feel this one slipping past every instinct she had. "I promise you." The confidence in that chamber had already started to crack, and it would not stop cracking until it reached the floor. The recording began without warning, filling every screen at once. 47 warships, each one logged with coordinates and dates going back 4 centuries. 23 hidden stations scattered through systems. The Concorde had mapped 1,000 times over and never once flagged as anything but empty rock. 12,000 operatives embedded in trade guilds, diplomatic corps, even 2 seats on the very council currently watching the feed in silence. Vexrath rose from his throne. It was the first time he had stood in the middle of a council session in 847 years, and the sound of it, the scrape of ceremonial robes against ancient stone, seemed louder than the transmission itself. "How?" he said. "Not a question, not really. More the sound a man makes when the floor gives way beneath him and his body hasn't caught up to the fact yet." Patiently, Valdez said. 200 light-years away, on the bridge of the Warden, Dahl watched the return feed of the throne room with wide eyes, her hands frozen over a console she no longer needed to touch. "Commander, he's standing. Emperor Vexrath is standing. I saw." Valdez didn't look up from her own display. She had rehearsed this moment for 2 years, in the quiet hours between shifts, and it still didn't feel the way she'd expected it to feel. Not triumphant. Just heavy, the way carrying something for a very long time feels heavy right before you finally set it down. Kane leaned toward her, voice low enough that it wouldn't carry over the open channel. "You know he's going to come back at us harder than this. Emperors like him don't fold. They escalate. Let him." She reached for the chipped mug beside her console and found the tea inside had gone fully cold. She drank it anyway. "We've been ready for that too." Back in the throne room, Elder Missouri had not moved from her alcove. Her large dark eyes tracked the recording as it played, not with surprise, but with something closer to recognition, the look of someone watching a prophecy arrive exactly on schedule. "Elder Missouri," Vexrath's voice cracked across the chamber, sharper now, edged with something none of his advisors had heard from him in living memory. "You knew. I promised to watch," Missouri said. It was the first time she had spoken since the session began, and every head in the chamber turned toward the sound. 400 years ago, the humans came to my species and asked us to keep that promise with them. I have kept it, Emperor. I have watched you dismiss them 3 times in your reign. I have watched you call them Category 3 while they built a fleet under your own capital. You will be silent. I have been silent for 900 years, Missouri said, and something in her voice made even the guards along the far wall go still. I do not think I will manage it again tonight. Zarakith stepped forward, data pane trembling in her hands, trying to find some version of the room she still recognized. Your Majesty, if I may, we should open a formal channel. Contain this before. Before what? Vexrath's molten eyes fixed on her, and for the first time in 3 centuries of service, Zarakith felt the full weight of a gaze that had ended 14 civilizations and absorbed 9 of them. Before the galaxy learns their emperor missed a fleet parked over his own capital for 400 years. She had no answer for that. She had never once in 300 years of practiced composure had no answer for anything. The transmission cut out for exactly 11 seconds, long enough for the silence to feel like its own kind of message. Then it resumed, Valdez's voice steady as before. We're not here to destroy your throne, Emperor. We could have. We're here because you signed an order to erase border colonies full of people who never did anything to you except exist quietly on the edge of your empire, where you never once bothered to look. They are 1 species among 46, Vexrath said. 402 years is a long time to plan a war you never intend to fight. A pause, though the certainty in his voice had begun to fray at the edges, thin as old rope. 1 border dispute. They're the 14 senators who voted against your annexation order, Valdez said. The ones you said had never once been right about anything. You might want to ask them why they voted the way they did. Silence again, longer this time, and in it, something shifted across the chamber that no sensor could have measured. Advisors who had stood rigid for the entire exchange began, one by one, to glance toward the 14 empty seats reserved for the dissenting delegations, seats that had sat unused and unremarked for the length of the entire session. Vexrath looked at those seats for a long moment. Then, slowly, he sat back down. It was not the same as standing up had been. This was quieter, heavier, the motion of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he'd forgotten it had a shape at all. Elder Missouri, he said, without looking at her. What do the humans want? I don't know, Missouri said. I have only ever been asked to watch. I was never told what came after. On the Warden's Bridge, a new light began blinking on Dahl's console, one that had never activated in her 4 years of service. She stared at it a full 3 seconds before she found her voice. Commander, we're picking up a second signal. She says she needs to speak to you before you send anything else to that throne. Valdez looked at the open channel still linking her ship to the chamber 200 light-years away, at Vexrath sitting motionless on his own throne for the first time in 8 centuries. It's not from the throne world. Valdez set the mug down. Source, the Valeth observation post. Dahl's hands moved fast now, pulling the feed onto the main display. Commander, it's Ambassador Rel. She says it's urgent. At Elder Missouri's ancient eyes fixed on nothing at all. Patch her through, she said, quietly. Ambassador Rel's voice came through clipped and fast, the sound of someone who had been holding words back for longer than was safe. Commander, stand down the second transmission. Do not send the full data reveal to every Concord world yet. Valdez kept her eyes on the throne room feed, where Vexrath still sat motionless. Missouri still stood in her alcove, the whole chamber frozen in the wake of what had already been said. Ambassador, that ship has been quiet for 4 centuries. I'm not inclined to stay quiet another hour without a reason. You have won. The Valeth aren't the only ones who've been watching that throne. Rel's tone dropped lower, careful even on a channel Valdez had called quiet. There's a faction inside the Concord military that's been waiting for exactly this. Officers who think Vexrath's gone soft after 8 centuries. If they see him humiliated on every screen in the Empire, they won't wait for him to recover. They'll move tonight. Kane looked up sharply from his console. Move how? A purge, Rel said. Not of humans, of him. And anyone they decide stood too close to the 14 dissenting senators when it happened. Valdez felt the mug cool further in her hand, though she barely noticed the temperature anymore. 400 years of watching, and the plan had never once accounted for the Empire eating itself before humanity finished making its point. How many senators are we talking about? she said. All 14. Possibly Elder Missouri as well, if they decide her testimony counts as treason. A pause heavy with everything Rel wasn't saying yet. Commander, you didn't just expose an emperor's mistake tonight. You handed his rivals a reason. Dahl's hands had gone still over her console. She was young enough that the weight of this hadn't fully landed yet, but old enough to see it approaching. Commander, what do we do? Valdez didn't answer right away. She looked at the mug in her hand, at the faded numbers on its side, and thought briefly of her father, who had told her once that the hardest part of any long watch was knowing when patience had done its job and it was time to act instead. Open the channel back to the throne, she said. Full transmission, everyone hears this. Kane's jaw tightened. Commander, if there's a faction planning a purge, broadcasting anything right now could give them a reason to move faster, or it could take the reason away entirely. Valdez set the mug down, this time for good. A purge needs secrecy to work, Lieutenant. I'm told there are officers in your command structure who intend to remove you tonight, along with the 14 senators who voted against your annexation order. Let's see how well it survives daylight. Back in the throne room, the transmission resumed, and this time Valdez's voice carried something new in it, an edge Vexrath hadn't heard in the first exchange. Emperor Vexrath, and possibly Elder Missouri for speaking the truth in front of you. The chamber's stillness cracked into something else entirely. Several advisors turned toward the door as if they expected soldiers to already be standing there. That is not possible, Zaraketh said, though her voice had lost every last trace of its practiced confidence. It is entirely possible, Missouri said quietly. It is, in fact, exactly what I have watched this empire do to itself 11 times in 900 years. Weakness is not punished by outsiders here, High Ambassador. It is punished by the ones closest to the throne. Vexrath's hands, still gripping the armrests, went white at the claw tips. He had spent 8 centuries believing his own certainty was the one law the universe could never break. He had never once considered that the law might break around him instead, quietly, from inside his own house. Name them, he said to Valdez. Because the moment I do, this becomes a war between factions in your court, and that's not the conversation I came here to have. Then what conversation did you come to have? For the first time since the transmission began, Valdez allowed a small pause. The one where you tell me whether you're still willing to be the emperor who's never been wrong, or whether you're finally ready to be the one who admits it, just this once, before it costs you everything. On the terrace far below the throne room, I won't. Her voice stayed level. Not because I'm protecting them, Emperor, the kind that let a listener lean in without quite knowing why. Out of sight of every camera and sensor grid the palace maintained, a man in the plain gray coat of a mid-tier logistics officer paused at a junction he had walked 100 times before. He glanced once at the black shape hanging in the sky, then continued on unhurried, carrying a folder of requisition forms toward a wing of the palace that had no business receiving requisition forms at this hour. No one stopped him. No one noticed him at all. He knocked twice on a plain door 3 floors below the war room, was led inside, and set the folder on a table already crowded with maps of the palace's internal defense grid. They've broadcast the threat, he said, which means we move now, or we don't move at all. The woman across the table, a decorated fleet officer whose name did not appear on any public roster, folded her arms. The ship changes nothing. If anything, it proves our point. That is a liability wearing a crown. And if the humans decide to protect him, then we deal with that when it happens. She reached for the folder, opened it. Vexrath let a human fleet sit over his own capital for 400 years and never noticed. That is not a ruler. And studied the maps beneath the requisition forms with the flat calm of someone who had planned this for longer than tonight. Sound the internal alert in 1 hour. Quietly, we move before dawn. None of this reached the throne room. None of it reached the warden. It moved through the palace's lower levels the way rot moves through a beam, invisible until the moment the ceiling gives way. In the throne room, Vexrath had not answered Valdez's question. He sat with his eyes fixed on the crystal ceiling above him, on the same stars Missouri had watched for 9 centuries, as if the answer might be written somewhere up there that he had simply never bothered to look. Your Majesty, Zaraketh's voice had dropped to something almost gentle, an unfamiliar register for a woman who had built her career on precision and distance. Whatever you decide, decide quickly. If there truly are officers planning to move, every minute you spend in silence is a minute you hand them. I am aware of the cost of silence, Ambassador. Vexrath's molten eyes finally lowered from the ceiling to meet Mazuri's. You said you were never told what the humans wanted after the watching ended. I wasn't. Then I will ask them myself. He turned back to the open channel, and for the first time in the entire exchange, his voice carried something other than certainty. It carried the sound of a man setting down a weight he had no name for yet. Commander Valdez, if I withdraw the order, if I stand in front of my own court and admit that I have been wrong, not once, but in the very foundation of how I have ruled for 8 centuries, what happens to me? The question hung in the chamber the way Mazuri's first words had, and this time it was Valdez's turn to let a silence stretch before she answered. I don't know, she said finally. That's not something I control, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I can tell you what happens if you don't ask it. Nothing changes. Not for you. Not for the 14 colonies you signed away this morning. Not for the officers in your own halls who are already deciding you're not worth protecting. Rel's voice cut back in, low and urgent, on the private channel only Valdez could hear. Commander, they're accelerating. Internal alert just went active. 1 hour, maybe less. Valdez closed her eyes for half a second, the only outward sign that anything had changed. When she opened them, her voice hadn't shifted at all. Emperor Vexrath. I need an answer faster than you're used to giving one. Vexrath rose from the throne a second time. This rise looked nothing like the first. The first had been shock, a body reacting before the mind caught up. This one was slow, deliberate, the motion of a man who understood exactly what he was choosing and had decided to choose it anyway. Withdraw the annexation order, he said, loud enough to carry to every screen still broadcasting the feed across the Empire. Effective immediately. No formal review, no committee, my word alone. Zaraketh's data pane slipped an inch in her grip before she caught it. In 3 centuries of service, she had never once heard him reverse a decision without ceremony, without a face-saving delay to make it look like strategy instead of surrender. Your Majesty, the officers? I know about the officers. Vexrath did not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the open channel, on the small green light that meant Valdez was still listening. Elder Mazuri, you said I made the same error your people made 2,000 years ago. The error of mistaking patience for weakness. I did. Tell me what your people did when they finally understood their mistake. Mazuri's ancient eyes softened, just slightly, the first gentleness she had shown all night. We stopped waiting for the ones who wronged us to prove themselves twice. We simply believed them the first time they told the truth. It was such a small thing to say. It was, Vexrath thought, the smallest and heaviest sentence anyone had spoken to him in 847 years. Somewhere below the war room, in a chamber with no cameras and no witnesses, the fleet officer with no name on any public roster checked the time and found it running short. Her internal alert had gone out. Loyalist guards had already begun moving toward the tower where the 14 senators were quietly held under a pretense of protective custody that had never fooled anyone who bothered to look closely. She did not know yet that the broadcast reaching every screen in the palace had already reached her own soldiers, standing in the tower corridor, weapons still holstered, listening to their emperor say a sentence none of them had ever heard him say before. I was wrong. A young lieutenant at the tower door, who had signed on for this operation because he believed in a stronger throne and not a broken one, lowered the hand that had been reaching for his weapon. He looked at the man beside him. Neither spoke, neither needed to. The purge did not fail because anyone stopped it. It failed because the reason for it evaporated in real time, on every screen, before the soldiers meant to carry it out had finished walking down one flight of stairs. Back in the throne room, Valdez set the mug down one final time and did not pick it up again. Emperor Vexrath, her voice, for the first time all night, carried something almost gentle. You asked me earlier what happens to you if you admit fault. I told you I didn't know. I still don't. But I can tell you what happens to the 14 colonies you signed away this morning. Tell me, nothing happens to them, because you're about to make sure of it. Vexrath looked at the 14 empty Senate seats one more time, then at Mazuri, then, finally, at the open channel that had shown him more of his own empire in one night than 8 centuries on the throne ever had. Send word to the tower, he said to Zaraketh, voice steady now in a way it hadn't been since the ship first appeared. The 14 senators are released, immediately. and find out which of my officers ordered that custody in the first place." Zaraketh, hands no longer trembling, moved to obey without a single word of protest. Vexwrath turned back to the crystal ceiling one last time, the same stars Missouri had watched for 900 years, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke again, it was quiet enough that the transmission almost lost it. 402 years, he said. "You could have ended my reign the day you decided to end your silence. Why didn't you? Because you never asked us to," Valdez said. "You never asked anyone anything, Emperor. Not once in 8 centuries. Tonight you finally did." He sat back down. Not the collapse of the first time, and not the careful diplomacy of a ruler managing his image. Just a man, sitting, the way anyone sits when a long weight has finally been set down, and the body doesn't yet know what to do with the sudden lightness. The transmission held a moment longer, silent. Both sides simply present with each other across 200 light-years of dark, and then it closed. 3 days later, no formal announcement marked the end of the annexation order. No ceremony, no public reversal, no admission carved into stone the way the Concorde usually recorded its history. Just a quiet notice through diplomatic channels, and 14 colonies that woke to find the threat against them had simply stopped existing overnight. The 14 senators returned to their seats. The fleet officer whose name had never appeared on any roster was quietly reassigned to a border post 3 systems away, her ambitions folded into paperwork no one would ever read twice. No one spoke publicly of what had almost happened in the tower. Everyone in the palace understood anyway. On the warden, Kane leaned back from his console for the first time in what felt like a full day. "It's done," he said. Disbelief still threaded through his voice. 400 years, and it's actually done. "It started," Valdez said. "Done is a different word." She stood at the viewport again, looking out at the same dark she had looked at the night before, and it did look different now, the way she had known it eventually would. Her father had carried a mug just like it decades before, on Earth's first interstellar freighter, and he had told her once, on one of the rare nights he talked about the stars instead of just flying toward them. Not safer. Just fully seen for the first time, she picked up the chipped mug from beside the console. The tea inside had gone cold hours ago. She had not noticed until now that the quietest ships were always the ones that never had to fire a shot. She had been young enough then to think it was just something fathers said. She understood it differently now. She set the mug down beside the transmission console, in the exact spot where it had sat when the first alarm came through, and did not pick it up again that night. It was a single frame from the palace's own security feed, time-stamped from the moment the ship first appeared above the Capitol. The kitchen worker on the lowest terrace, frozen mid-step, staring up at a shape twice the width of the moon. Dahl glanced over from her station. "Commander, Elder Missouri sent something? No message attached, just an image file." Valdez opened it, one hand still half raised where the tray had already left it. Beneath the image, Missouri had written nothing at all. She hadn't needed to. Valdez closed the file, and for a long while the bridge held nothing but the low hum of a ship that no longer needed to hide and the quiet, ordinary sound of a mug sitting empty beside a console, its faded numbers catching the last of the light.